myself into a liturgical or homiletical corner of sorts. So 3 weeks ago, we started printing a coffee hour question bulletin. And the hope was this would help all of us initiate a conversation with someone we might not know as well after the service. And on Tuesday, Lynn came to me and asked me what's the coffee hour question. And I thought about the gospel reading and our lectionary, and I thought that what was being given to us was an opportunity to talk about the tension between tradition and innovation. Hence the question. The problem is that while I thought this tension was the focus of the debate between the Pharisees and Jesus, I am now no longer convinced. And there are 3 reasons why I think that this gospel lesson is not about the role of tradition in our corporate faith life. The first is Jesus' appeal to David's behavior. In 1 Samuel chapter 21, David isn't pining for a snap between courtly receptions. He's being chased by King Saul, who sees David as a threat to his own rule as monarch. The second actually comes to us from our Old Testament lesson. Many times we only consider the calling of Samuel as a heartwarming story of Eli's wisdom and the beginning of Samuel's prophetic career. But what we so often overlook is that every beginning comes from some other beginning's end. The Lord God called Samuel because the Lord was rejecting Eli. His sons were a scandal, they were blasphemers, and Eli had not restrained them. Samuel in the temple isn't a call story as much as it is a benching. And the last detail that makes me think that this isn't a story only about tradition is the Pharisees' response to Jesus' teaching. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. What is so curious to me is that the Pharisees aren't retreating to the temple in Jerusalem or consulting the high priest about this spiritual revelation. Their response is purely political. And of all people, they go to the Herodians, a rather curious bedfellow, as King Herod and the Pharisees would have likely pursued very, very different political agendas. And yet somehow they both think that this Jesus needs to be put in his place. And so to me, the question of Jesus healing on the Sabbath isn't pointing us to the tension between tradition and innovation. I think it's asking a far more fundamental question of what authority does tradition have in our corporate life? It isn't and can't be a coincidence that in each of my 3 reasons, we see in history a transition in leadership between Eli and Samuel, between Saul and David, and ultimately between the Pharisees and Jesus. Tradition would see all 3 of these lines of authority continue in perpetuity. Eli's priestly line, Saul's kingship, even the law itself as understood by the Pharisees. And yet we hear a story of God interrupting tradition in order to do something new. Now, this seems like an appropriate time for me to admit my bias, because I'm not without interest in this topic. I have always been skeptical of tradition's authority in the church. In my experience, it's either too easy to corrupt, or worse, to make the mistake of to mistake the importance of tradition with the intent of tradition. So take 2 examples as to why I think tradition is suspicious. Many of you may have noticed in these past few months that when I pronounce the blessing at the end of the service, my pinky is drawn down to my palm. And you may have seen a number of icons where Jesus makes a similar gesture. gesture has nothing to do with Jesus and everything to do with my patristic professor in seminary. When I was in my last year of seminary, some students asked Professor Rowan Greer about the meaning of his lessons. He did this as well. And he was utterly confused and confounded. The students asked, is there something special about this? He said, no, I have a gimp pinky. He wasn't trying to mimic Jesus in a particular fashion. His pinky was always down because he couldn't extend it. And I'm willing to wager that there are hundreds of Yale-trained priests like me who bless like this because that's what Professor Greer did. Another example. When I was a freshman in college, I lived in the multicultural hall. And part of living in that community was a commitment to learn about and participate in various cultural activities. In October, we had a lesson in Mexican folkloric dancing. We were in the common room of our hall, and as we were kind of swaying side to side, I'm so glad I've got a pole here so you can't see my door. The instructor would look over his shoulder. Well, the lesson ended, and we had a few more practices before our performance the first week of November. And when we did perform, the instructor was again totally dumbfounded. Why did you keep looking over your shoulder? Well, because you did. Well, the instructor returned back and no, I looked over my shoulder because we're not in a dance studio and I can't see what you're doing. And there's the problem. Sometimes tradition transmits more than it intends to. But what the gospel lesson fears this morning is tradition that is focused more on ritual than on meaning. Because eventually, being right becomes more important than doing right. The practice of the Sabbath in Jesus' time had become calcified. What I think we can infer from Jesus' counterpoint is that the Sabbath was intended for humanity as a practice of honoring God. The original intent transmogrified into the act of doing nothing, and standing still and idle became prioritized over honoring God, which was the whole point of that tradition. And I think we need to be very clear on the distinction. Jesus is not calling for the end of the Sabbath practice. Instead, Jesus suggests that the Sabbath, the practice of honoring God, can be fulfilled by action instead of by rest. Honoring God is the tradition that is at stake. And in pursuing that, we might find ourselves amending our practices because we will no longer prioritize being idle over doing good. And I think that that is the good news for us this morning. The recognition that we are called to marry the practice with the intention of our traditions. Traditions can, and in our practice does, have authority in our community. But traditional practices without intention are just a recipe for heartless legalism. Similarly, a constant intention to innovate without any grounding practice is just a spirituality of the month club devoid of any theology. The lesson of our lectionary text this morning is the reminder that the conflict isn't necessarily between tradition and innovation. It is a conflict between a religion which hardens hearts and a gospel which opens. It is an invitation to a series of practices that rising sun, you can spell it S-O-N or S-U-N. Why do you all look to the rising sun in the east on Sunday morning? It is a practice that reminds us of Christ's victory over death. But does that mean that we cannot explore other times to gather for worship? If our broader social conventions no longer bracket Sunday mornings from youth sports and from other claims on our lives, is it possible for us to innovate other liturgies that would allow young ones and their families the ability to keep in the fellowship of the church and in the breaking of the bread? It very may well. In the final analysis, perhaps the answer can be found in whether or not we are opening our minds to a new thing God might be doing, or if we by ourselves are closing our own heart. But if we do, like Eli, like Saul and the Pharisees, if we close our hearts to a new thing God may be calling us to, we can't be surprised when God decides to do what, as Eli says, seems good for the Almighty. Tradition and innovation both have a place in our community. We have to be open to what God has told us to do, but more importantly, why God has called us to these particular set of practices. When we do that, I think we will find ourselves both holding fast to a tradition which we love, as well as being called into new corners and new expressions of our corporate faith together. That